Hi everyone, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles, the series of books and videos on American history as seen through the lives of the presidents of the United States. This episode is from the life of Abraham Lincoln, and the focus is secession and the Declaration. And those are our two topics for today. We begin with secession and Abraham Lincoln's position in his inaugural address that secession was simply not permitted. He told the country that no state upon its mere motion can lawfully get out of the Union, that resolves and ordinances to that effect are legally void. Talking to the 7 states that had already seceded, other states that were thinking about it, Lincoln put a line in the sand exactly where he stood. But Lincoln was not alone in his view about secession from the views of the presidents of the United States. And we have different views in part because the Constitution that the presidents all swore an oath to follow is silent on the topic of getting out of the Union. There's certainly discussion in the Constitution about how new states can come into the Union. There is nothing in the Constitution, both for or against the right or the authority to actually leave the Union, what we call secession. So that has created differences of opinion, different points of view, whether it's the courts, the legislature, but in this series, we're focused on the views of the presidents, and so we thought we'd run down where did the presidents stand, the ones who spoke about this topic, on the different sides of secession. Perhaps the most aligned to Lincoln and the most strongly against the authority for any state to leave the Union was Andrew Jackson, who talked about it a lot during the nullification crisis in the 1830s, in which he said that the Constitution and the laws are supreme and the Union indissoluble. To say that any state may at pleasure secede from the Union is to say that the United States are not a nation, because it would be a solecism to contend that any part of a nation might dissolve its connection with the other parts to their injury or ruin without committing any offense. And Jackson was ready to use force to stop nullification or potentially secession at the time. Not a surprise that his handpicked successor, Martin Van Buren, would agree. Van Buren noted that secession receives no countenance, much less sanction from the federal Constitution. It is founded neither on reason or justice. A little later, Millard Fillmore, when the time of the war came out, he agreed. He said the state as such had no authority to secede, and consequently the ordinance of secession was absolutely void. Another in this camp, against the right of secession, Andrew Johnson, Abraham Lincoln's successor, the 17th president of the United States, also in this camp. But they're not exclusive, because there were presidents who thought the opposite. The leader in that movement was John Tyler. John Tyler, in fact, joined the Confederacy along with his native state of Virginia, and he was probably the most strident states' rights-oriented president that the country had seen to date, and he echoed that sentiment when he said that the government created by the states is amenable to the states, is preserved by the states, and may be destroyed by the states. The federal government held its existence, according to Tyler, at the pleasure of these states. They may strike you, the federal government, out of existence by a word, demolish the Constitution, and scatter its fragments to the winds. Not a surprise that Tyler supported his state of Virginia to move out of the Union, something that he believed was certainly permissible. Another along those lines who thought that secession under the right circumstances might become appropriate was the author of that Declaration of Independence we're going to talk about in a moment, and that's Thomas Jefferson. And he wrote about this in a letter to James Madison at the time of their nullification focus, the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions being written 1798, 1799, arguing against in their minds, the unconstitutional Alien Act and Sedition Act. And they wrote these nullification documents to get those states of Kentucky and Virginia to say that those laws were null and void. But Jefferson went a step further. In a letter to Madison during this time, he wrote that, "But determined were we to be disappointed in this, to sever ourselves from that union we do much value, rather than give up the rights of self-government, which we have reserved, and in which alone we see liberty, safety, and happiness." Jefferson was wont to say that he liked a little rebellion now and then, to keep the government, the people in power, honest, that they are there to serve the people. He had supported the Whiskey Rebellion and Shays Rebellion. It would not be a surprise to see that Thomas Jefferson, under the right circumstances, would believe that separation from the existing government was perfectly appropriate, even under the U.S. Constitution. And we'll talk more about that when we talk about his declaration. Now, some presidents had a little bit more of a nuanced approach. Ulysses Grant, for example, wrote in his memoirs that at the time of the founding, shortly after the states or the colonies had come together, maybe there was a right to secession at the time. But Grant concluded that the problem changed on the ratification of the Constitution by all the colonies, and it changed still more when amendments were added. And if the right of any one state to withdraw continued to exist at all after the ratification of the Constitution, it certainly ceased on the formation of new states, at least so far as the new states themselves were concerned. In this context, secession was illogical as well as impractical. It was revolution. It had become that way over time in the eyes of Ulysses Grant. We've already talked about in a previous episode regarding Mr. Lincoln on James Buchanan, his predecessor, and where he stood on this topic of secession. And he took sort of two stands, and they were difficult to reconcile. The first being secession was not an inherent constitutional right. According to Buchanan, secession is neither more nor less than revolution. But Buchanan concluded he had no power to do anything about it because he said if answered in the affirmative, it must be on the principle that the power has been conferred upon Congress to make war against a state. After much serious reflection, I have arrived at the conclusion that no such power has been delegated to Congress or to any other department of the federal government. Secession unconstitutional, according to Buchanan. No power to stop it, according to Buchanan. Then you had a couple of presidents who didn't really opine as much on the constitutionality of secession, but more on its propriety at a point in time. Franklin Pierce, for example, who had been in the White House just 4 years before Lincoln. Now the Civil War is beginning and secession is happening, and Pierce was asked his opinion, and he concluded that if we cannot live together in peace, then in peace and on just terms, let us separate. Maybe separation would be better, constitutional or not, didn't say, but maybe we'd actually be better off if we went our separate ways. Another who was of this mind wrote in his diary 40 years before, in 1820, John Quincy Adams, a really thoughtful moment, really the first time that the nation faced this potential fracture point when Missouri was seeking to come into the Union as a slave state, and this is where the expansion of slavery, the controversy was erupting, and the Missouri Compromise eventually quelled things for some time. But at the time of that compromise, Adams wrote that perhaps it would have been a wiser and bolder course to have persisted in the restriction of Missouri until it should have terminated in a convention of the states to revise and amend the Constitution. Now, this would have produced a new union of 13 or 14 states unpolluted with slavery, with a great and glorious object, that of rallying to their standard the other states by the universal emancipation of their slaves. If the Union must be dissolved, Quincy Adams wrote, slavery is precisely the question upon which it ought to break. For the present, however, this contest is laid asleep. It did lay dormant. Didn't lay completely dormant, but eventually it would erupt about 40 years later with now Abraham Lincoln in the White House. And Lincoln again had concluded in his inaugural that acts of violence within any state or states against the authority of the United States are insurrectionary or revolutionary according to circumstances. And unlike Buchanan, who thought that secession was unconstitutional, but he could do nothing about it, Lincoln was asserting it's unconstitutional and he had every intention of doing something about it. We don't have unanimity amongst the presidents of the United States on this topic of secession, again in large part because the Constitution itself is silent. When Lincoln thought of the founding documents, frankly, he was much more aligned with the other one, the Declaration of Independence, than he was the Constitution. In fact, John Nicolay, very close to Lincoln as his aide and secretary, said the Declaration of Independence was his political chart and inspiration. Lincoln himself said when he was in Philadelphia, the site where the Declaration had been written and signed, he, just before his inaugural, as he's making that trek from Springfield, Illinois to Washington, D.C., he stopped in Philadelphia and he said, I have never had a feeling politically that did not spring from the sentiments embodied in the Declaration of Independence. I would rather be assassinated on the spot than to surrender it. So what did Lincoln really mean by this? And mostly he meant One line in the Declaration. 35 words, maybe the most powerful and poignant 35 words about the American experiment ever written, came from Thomas Jefferson's pen and said ever so simply that we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The American experiment spawned more from those 35 words than probably anything else. And Lincoln's focus, of course, being over and over the line, the phrase that all men are created equal. We've talked about in the debates how he used this in his own rationale to talk not just about whites, but also about blacks, and the foundation for a lot of his political beliefs. But this one sentence is only 35 words. It represents 3% of the Declaration of Independence. So what about the rest of the Declaration of Independence, and what was that all about? Well, let's start with the first sentence. The Declaration begins, when in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitle them, a decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to the separation. That's the purpose of the Declaration of Independence. It is a report from the Declaration Committee to explain to the world why these united colonies are and ought to be free and independent from the mother country of Great Britain. What's another word for that? It's called secession. This is what the Declaration of Independence was all about, providing sort of the legal and the moral rationale for why this part of this government of England has a right and is going to move forward to separate from the main government, from the mothership. That's what the Declaration of Independence was all about, and it goes on to list 28 specific reasons on why separation, secession, was the right move for the colonists at the time, and could have easily been written very similarly, with different reasons of course, by the Confederates in 1860 and 1861. In the Declaration of Independence, Jefferson wrote that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it and to institute new government. This was the mindset of the Confederates in 1861. Jefferson also wrote in the Declaration that prudence indeed will dictate that governments long established should not be changed for light and transient causes. But when a long train of abuses and usurpations, pursuing invariably the same object, evinces a design to reduce them under absolute despotism, it is their right, it is their duty to throw off such government and to provide new guards for their future security. Again, these were the words Thomas Jefferson at the time of the founding of the United States as the rationale and justification to leave the existing government in the mother country of England. It could easily have been the same words that were talked about in the secession conventions that were being held in the South in 1860 and 1861 that Abraham Lincoln had just said that those actions under the U.S. Constitution and under him as President of the United States are legally void. Lincoln didn't always have that perspective, though, because Lincoln, maybe he did look at the other words in the Declaration of Independence and believe more broadly than just the line about all men are created equal. And at one point, maybe he did believe that this right to be rarely used, but under certain circumstances, if a part of a country feels like they are now operating under a despotism and can't get any relief, that maybe it's okay to rise up and separate. Well, we know he believed that at one point because he said so as a congressman in the 1840s when he was talking about the people of Texas and their plan to separate from Mexico. At that time, Abraham Lincoln said that any people anywhere have the right to rise up and shake off the existing government and form a new one that suits them better. Any portion of such people that may revolutionize and make their own of so much of the territory as they inhabit. This is a most valuable, a most sacred right, a right which we hope and believe is to liberate the world, because it was the right that started the United States of America. And it was the right that Abraham Lincoln now said in 1861, despite his reverence for the Declaration of Independence, that right no longer existed, not in the United States, not under the Constitution, and he was going to do everything he can to stop it in 1861. That is Abraham Lincoln and secession and the Declaration from the life of Abraham Lincoln. For more Presidential Chronicles, check out my books on Amazon.com, and don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Until next time, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles.